November 3rd, 1943. Eero 3:40 hours, 180 miles northeast of Truk Lagoon, Caroline Islands. Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans stood on the bridge of USS Johnston DD 557, one of the new Fletcher-class destroyers, watching his sonar operator's face go white. The ping return was unmistakable. A Japanese I-class submarine, range 1, 200 yards, depth 180 feet, course steady. Evans had 17 minutes of fuel remaining before he'd have to break off pursuit to rendezvous with the carrier group. The I-174 had already sunk 2 merchantmen that week. 37 American sailors were dead. Now the bastard was running deep, betting everything that Evans would do what every destroyer captain did: make a depth charge run, roll canisters off the stern, hope one of them fell close enough to crack the pressure hull. The problem was simple and infuriating. Depth charges were nearly worthless. Before we continue with Commander Evans's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now, back to those dark waters northeast of Truk, where Evans was about to make a decision that would change the submarine war in the Pacific forever. Evans grew up in Pawnee, Oklahoma, the son of a Cherokee father and a white mother in a town where neither community fully accepted him. He was 5'7", wiry, with hands scarred from working his uncle's ranch before the Depression made that impossible. He joined the Navy in 1931 because it was the only job that didn't care about his mixed blood. They cared whether you could do the work. By 1943, at age 36, he'd worked his way from enlisted man to commander, surviving the chaos at Pearl Harbor aboard the destroyer Alwyn, where he'd watched the Arizona explode 400 yards away. He knew destroyers. He knew submarines, and he knew the math that was killing American sailors. Between January 1942 and August 1943, U.S. Navy destroyers made 947 depth charge attacks on confirmed Japanese submarine contacts in the Pacific Theater. They sank 18 submarines, a success rate of 9%. The problem wasn't courage. Destroyer crews pressed attacks with insane bravery, charging straight at submarines that could blow them apart with a spread of Type 95 torpedoes. The problem wasn't even the depth charges themselves, 600-pound canisters of Torpex explosive that could crack a submarine's hull if they detonated within 25 feet. The problem was physics. A depth charge attack required the destroyer to pass directly over the submarine's last known position, then roll the charges off the stern, set to detonate at the target's estimated depth. But the moment the destroyer's screws churned overhead, the submarine's captain knew exactly where the attack was coming from and had precious seconds to change depth and course. By the time the charges sank, falling at roughly 10 feet per second, and detonated, the submarine had moved. Not far. 50 yards, maybe 70. But in the three-dimensional darkness of the Pacific, 50 yards might as well be 50 miles. Worse, the instant the destroyer passed over the target, sonar contact was lost. The submarine vanished into the blind zone created by the destroyer's own wake and noise. Every attack was a guess, an educated guess, but still a guess. You rolled your charges, crossed your fingers, and hoped. The Japanese submariners called American destroyers bakamano, monsters, but they weren't afraid of them. They were contemptuous. Veteran I-boat commanders had survived dozens of depth charge attacks. They'd learned the pattern: hear the screws approaching, wait for the destroyer to pass overhead, then dive or turn hard. The massive detonations would shake the boat, crack some light bulbs, terrify the younger crewmen. But survival rates were high. The Americans were predictable. Lieutenant Junior Grade William Morrison was Evans's sonar officer, a tall kid from Seattle with perfect pitch who could identify a submarine by the sound of its screws alone. Morrison had a deal with his best friend, torpedoman First Class Robert Chen from San Francisco. When the war ended, they'd pool their savings and open an auto repair shop. Morrison and Chen's 50-50 partnership specializing in marine engines. They'd shaken hands on it the night before Johnston shipped out from Pearl Harbor. Morrison died on September 8, 1943. Johnston had been tracking a submarine contact for 40 minutes, a Japanese RO-class boat running deep after attacking a tanker convoy. Morrison had the contact locked, calling out ranges and bearings with machine precision. The submarine captain was good. He kept changing depth and course, never holding steady long enough for a clean attack setup. But Morrison stayed with him. Evans made 3 depth charge runs, rolling 12 charges on each pass. 36 explosions, 0 hits. On the 4th run, the submarine got lucky or skilled, probably both. As Johnston passed overhead and lost sonar contact, the RO boat went shallow instead of deep reversed course and put 2 Type 92 torpedoes into the water. The destroyer's lookout spotted the wakes at 200 yards. Too close. 1 torpedo missed by 15 feet. The other hit Johnston amidships on the port side, blowing a hole the size of a truck in the hull. Morrison was in the sonar shack directly above the impact point. The blast vaporized him instantly. They never found enough of him to bury. 23 other men died in that attack. Johnston limped back to Pearl Harbor for 3 months of repairs. Chen survived. He'd been aft in the torpedo magazine, but he never smiled again after Morrison died. He transferred to shore duty 2 weeks later. Evans attended the funeral in Seattle. Morrison's mother asked him why her son had died. Evans had no answer that made sense. The submarine that killed Morrison escaped. 4 days later, it sank another freighter off Guadalcanal. The Fletcher-class destroyers were supposed to solve the submarine problem. Sleek, fast, bristling with weapons, 5 5-inch guns, 10 torpedo tubes, 2 depth charge racks, 6 K-gun projectors that could hurl charges 150 feet to either side. The Fletchers were the most heavily armed destroyers ever built. Between 1942 and 1945, the U.S. Navy commissioned 175 of them, more than any other destroyer class in history. But in the first 18 months of Pacific combat, those 175 destroyers using conventional depth charge tactics sank exactly 42 Japanese submarines. Less than 1 sub per destroyer, despite hundreds of confirmed contacts and thousands of attacks. The Japanese submarine force, smaller, older, more poorly maintained than Germany's U-boats, was operating with near impunity in American-controlled waters. Between Pearl Harbor and the summer of 1943, Japanese submarines sank 184 American ships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, merchantmen, transports. Thousands of sailors died. Something was fundamentally wrong with American anti-submarine warfare, and everyone knew it. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance knew it. The destroyer squadron commanders knew it. The men actually hunting the submarines definitely knew it, but nobody could figure out how to fix it. The British had already solved it. They'd just never told the Americans. In 1941, a British naval officer named Charles Goodeve had developed a weapon called the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing mortar system that fired 24 small projectiles, each containing 35 pounds of Torpex, in an elliptical pattern 250 yards ahead of the attacking ship. The projectiles were contact-fused, meaning they only detonated if they physically struck the submarine. No hit, no explosion. This was revolutionary for one simple reason: the attacking ship never lost sonar contact. A destroyer equipped with Hedgehog could track the submarine continuously, adjust course in real time, and maintain a firing solution all the way through the attack. The submarine's captain had no warning, no moment when the destroyer passed overhead and went blind. The mortars just suddenly flew out of the darkness and hit him, or missed silently. By early 1943, British corvettes and frigates using Hedgehog were sinking German U-boats at 5 times the rate of depth charge attacks. The system was proven. It worked. The British offered to share it with the U.S. Navy through the Lend-Lease program. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance rejected it. The official reasoning was insane. Hedgehog was unproven in American service, required extensive modification to fit American destroyers, and would disrupt production schedules. The real reason was uglier. The Bureau of Ordnance had spent a decade refining depth charge tactics and had zero interest in admitting those tactics didn't work. Adopting a British weapon would be an admission of American failure. The Bureau buried the Hedgehog proposal in paperwork and went back to building more depth charges. Destroyer captains in the Pacific were not consulted. When Johnston returned to Pearl Harbor in October 1943 after her repairs, Evans attended a classified briefing on submarine warfare tactics. The briefing officer, a desk-bound commander who'd never hunted a submarine in his life, spent 2 hours explaining refined depth charge patterns and new fusing techniques. Evans sat in the back, watching captains who'd actually faced Japanese torpedoes try not to fall asleep. At the end, the briefing officer asked for questions. Evans stood up. "Sir, what about the Hedgehog system the British are using? I've seen the intelligence reports. 27% kill rate versus 4% for depth charges. Why aren't we installing them?" The briefing officer's face went stiff. "That system hasn't been approved for US vessels, Commander. Bureau of Ordnance is evaluating it. Until then, we use depth charges. Any other questions?" Nobody asked anything else. But after the briefing, 3 other destroyer captains found Evans at the officers' club. They'd all read the same intelligence reports. They'd all had the same realization. And they all understood that official channels were going to get more of their men killed, while bureaucrats argued about production schedules and national pride. Evans made a decision that night that could have ended his career or put him in front of a court-martial board. He was going to install a Hedgehog system on Johnston, whether the Bureau of Ordnance approved it or not. The first problem was obtaining the hardware. The US Navy didn't manufacture Hedgehog systems yet. The British were producing them at a munitions factory in Newcastle, and every unit was earmarked for Royal Navy vessels or occasionally Canadian corvettes. Evans couldn't exactly requisition one through official channels without triggering questions he didn't want to answer. He got lucky in a way that only happens in wartime, when regulations collapse under the weight of genuine need. A British town-class destroyer, HMS Brighton, had pulled into Pearl Harbor for emergency repairs after taking a bomb hit during an air raid near Rabaul. The blast had wrecked the ship's forward superstructure, including its Hedgehog mounting. The weapon system itself was intact, but the mounting frame was twisted beyond repair. British Navy protocol required removing the entire system and shipping it back to Britain for refurbishment. That would take 6 months minimum, probably longer. The Brighton's captain was furious. He wanted his ship back in the fight, not sitting in Pearl Harbor waiting for replacement parts that might never arrive. Evans met the Brighton's captain, Lieutenant Commander James Ashford, at a poker game in the officers' quarters. Ashford was drunk, angry, and ranting about Navy bureaucracy. Evans bought him another whiskey and asked a simple question. "What are you planning to do with that Hedgehog system while you wait for the new mounting?" Ashford looked at him with the expression of a man who suddenly understands he's found a co-conspirator. Officially, it's being inventoried for return shipment. Unofficially, it's sitting in a warehouse at the shipyard because nobody's quite gotten around to the paperwork. "How long?" Evans asked. "Before someone officially notices it's there?" Ashford grinned. "In this chaos? Could be weeks, could be months. Things get misplaced during wartime, Commander. Terrible shame when that happens." They shook hands. 3 days later, a work crew from Johnston, wearing borrowed British Navy fatigues, arrived at the warehouse with a requisition form that looked official if you didn't examine it too closely. They loaded the Hedgehog system onto a flatbed truck at 200 hours, when the fewest people were around to ask questions. By dawn, it was aboard Johnston, covered with a tarp and hidden behind extra depth charge canisters on the forward deck. Evans now had a Mark 10 Hedgehog system, 24 mortar tubes arranged in an elliptical pattern, forward-firing, designed to throw contact-fused projectiles 250 yards ahead of the ship. He also had no mounting bracket, no official installation manual, and no authorization whatsoever to modify a U.S. Navy destroyer's armament without Bureau of Ordnance approval. If anyone found out, his career was over. Evans brought 3 people into the conspiracy: Chief Machinist's mate Andrew Larson, a 42-year-old veteran from Wisconsin who could fabricate anything from scrap metal; Lieutenant Robert Hagan, the ship's gunnery officer, and the only other man aboard who'd actually read the British intelligence reports on Hedgehog effectiveness; and Chief Torpedoman Michael Sullivan, who understood explosive fusing systems better than anyone Evans had ever met. He gathered them in his quarters at midnight, spread the British installation manual, which Ashford had accidentally included with the hardware, across his desk, and said 6 words. "We're installing this. Nobody else knows." Larsen looked at the manual, looked at Evans, and grinned. "Captain, you know this is completely against regulations? Are you going to help me or not?" "Hell yes, sir. I'm just making sure you know what you're risking." They all knew they didn't care. Morrison's death was 9 weeks old. Every man aboard Johnston remembered the explosion, remembered pulling bodies from flooded compartments, remembered the helplessness of rolling depth charges that never hit anything. If there was a weapon that actually worked, regulations could go to hell. The installation took 11 days, working only at night when the shipyard crews had gone home. The biggest problem was the mounting. The Hedgehog's original frame was designed for a British destroyer's foredeck configuration, which didn't match Johnston's layout. Larsen had to fabricate a custom bracket using steel plate scavenged from a damaged PT boat in the shipyard. He worked in the machine shop after hours, telling anyone who asked that he was repairing engine mounts. The bracket weighed 340 pounds. They installed it in a single night, 8 hours of back-breaking work, bolting it to Johnston's forward deck between the No. 2 5-inch gun mount and the superstructure. Sullivan wired the firing circuits into the ship's electrical system, routing the controls to a new panel on the bridge. Hagen calibrated the mortar's elevation and trained the gun crew on loading procedures. The hardest part wasn't the physical installation. It was hiding what they'd done. The Hedgehog was visible to anyone who walked past Johnston's forward deck, but most shipyard workers and Navy inspectors had no idea what they were looking at. It resembled a cluster of large pipes, which wasn't unusual on a destroyer bristling with torpedo tubes, depth charge throwers, and anti-aircraft mounts. Evans had the crew paint it the same grey as the rest of the ship and label it Forward DC Projector, Experimental. Nobody questioned it. In the chaos of Pearl Harbor in late 1943, with ships being refitted and modified constantly, one more piece of strange equipment wasn't worth a second glance. On November 1, 1943, Johnston completed her refit and received orders to rejoin Destroyer Squadron 23 for screening duty with Task Force 38. They had 72 hours before deployment. Evans used that time to conduct a single test firing at 5:30 hours in a remote section of the harbor with only his core conspirators watching. They loaded 12 practice rounds, inert projectiles with no explosive designed for training, into the Hedgehog Mortars. Hagen set the firing solution for a simulated target at 200 yards, depth 150 feet. Evans gave the order. The mortars fired with a sound like a thunderclap multiplied by 24, a rapid sequence of hollow whump-whump-whump impacts that rattled every window on the bridge. The projectiles arced through the pre-dawn darkness and splashed into the water in a perfect elliptical pattern, roughly 30 feet across, exactly where Hagen had calculated. They watched the chronometer. At 15 seconds, if the projectiles had been live and had hit a submarine hull, they would have detonated. They hit nothing because there was no submarine, but the pattern was perfect. The system worked. Sullivan looked at Evans and said quietly, "Captain, I've been in the Navy 18 years. I've never seen anything fire that clean on the first test." Evans allowed himself a smile. "Let's hope it works as well when something's shooting back." 2 days later, Johnston steamed out of Pearl Harbor as part of a 7-destroyer screen protecting the carriers Essex and Bunker Hill. They were hunting Japanese submarines, and for the first time in the Pacific War, an American destroyer had a weapon that might actually kill them. The contact came 38 hours into the patrol, November 3rd, 0340 hours. Sonar operator 2nd Class David Mitchell, a 21-year-old kid from Maine who'd joined up 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, picked up a clear ping at 200 yards. Mitchell had been trained by Morrison before Morrison died. He knew what he was hearing. "Submarine contact bearing 275, range 1200, depth estimated 180 feet. Contact is slow and steady, sir. I think he's stalking the carrier group." Evans was on the bridge in 15 seconds. The tactical plot showed I-174's probable position between Johnston and the carriers, in perfect position to put torpedoes into Essex if she got the chance. Other destroyers in the screen had been alerted, but Johnston had the closest contact. This was their fight. Evans's executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert Billings, was already plotting an intercept course. "Standard depth charge run, sir. We can be over the target in 8 minutes. Evans looked at the plot, looked at Mitchell's sonar readings, and made the decision. "Negative. We're using the Hedgehog." Dead silence on the bridge. Every officer knew about the Hedgehog now. Evans had briefed them 3 days ago, explaining exactly what it was, how it worked, and that it was completely unauthorized. He'd given them the choice: support the plan or request transfer to another ship. No questions asked. Every single officer had stayed. But this was the first time they'd use it in combat. Billings recovered first. "Aye, sir, Hedgehog attack, setting approach course now." The beauty of the Hedgehog was its simplicity. Instead of charging straight at the submarine and passing overhead, Evans could approach from any angle, maintain sonar contact continuously, and fire when the solution was perfect. He ordered a course that kept Johnston 300 yards ahead of I-174's projected position, matching her speed, keeping the submarine directly on the bow where the mortars were aimed. Mitchell kept calling ranges. 1,000 yards, contact steady. "He doesn't know we're here, sir." That was the Japanese submarine's fatal mistake. The captain of I-174, Commander Shinji Nakamura, a 7-year veteran with 3 confirmed kills, was running his standard patrol pattern, slow and deep, listening for the sounds of American ships, waiting for an opportunity to attack. He'd survived 4 depth charge attacks earlier in the war. He knew the pattern. When an American destroyer approached, you heard the screws churning closer, felt the moment they passed overhead. Then the depth charges detonated and you changed course and survived. It was almost routine. But Johnston wasn't charging. She was pacing him. 800 yards, Mitchell called. "Contact firm, no change in depth or course." Evans watched the tactical plot. Hagen was on the forward deck, supervising the Hedgehog crew. Sullivan was at the fusing panel. Every mortar was loaded with a live round. 35 pounds of Torpex in each projectile, contact fused, ready to fire. 600 yards, target bearing 277, depth 175. The mathematics were perfect. Hedgehog projectiles fell through water at approximately 23 feet per second. At 175 feet deep, the flight time would be roughly 7.5 seconds. If I-174 maintained her current course and speed, and she would because Nakamura had no idea he was being hunted, the projectiles would land directly on top of her. 500 yards. Solution locked. Evans took a breath. Morrison's face flickered through his mind. Morrison calling out sonar ranges. Morrison laughing about his auto repair shop. Morrison vaporized by a torpedo that never should have hit Johnston in the first place. Fire. Hagen hit the firing switch. 24 mortars fired in a rippling sequence that took 2 seconds, the sound like a giant drum roll. The projectiles, each about the size of a bowling pin, stabilized by small fins, arced through the darkness and splashed into the Pacific in an elliptical pattern 250 yards ahead of Johnston's bow. The ship's sonar tracked them falling, tracked I-174 below, watched the geometry converge. In the sonar shack, Mitchell was counting. 7 seconds. 8 seconds. The explosion came at 9 seconds. Not one explosion, 4. The Hedgehog pattern was 30 feet across at its widest point. I-174 was roughly 28 feet wide. 4 projectiles struck her hull, 1 forward near the torpedo room, 2 amidships, 1 aft near the engine room. Each projectile carried 35 pounds of Torpex, more than enough to crack a submarine's pressure hull at depth. The first impact ruptured I-174's forward ballast tanks. The second and third blew holes through the control room and flooded the entire midship section in under 15 seconds. The fourth shattered the engine room and killed every man there instantly. The submarine didn't implode. There was no single catastrophic collapse. She just died. Flooding, darkness, chaos. Men screaming in compartments that were filling with seawater faster than they could close the hatches. I-174 went down with all 68 hands. Commander Nakamura never knew what hit him. The sonar explosion was unmistakable. Multiple detonations, then the grinding shriek of metal collapsing, then silence. Mitchell ripped off his headphones, his hands shaking. "Contact lost, sir." Multiple explosions. "She's gone. She's fucking gone." Every man on Johnston's bridge stood frozen for 3 seconds. They'd seen depth charge attacks where everyone thought they'd scored a kill, only to have the submarine surface miles away and escape. But this was different. 4 direct hits. The sound of a submarine dying. No ambiguity. Billings broke the silence. "Captain, did we just—" "We did," Evans said quietly. "Battle station secure. Resume patrol course." They stayed at general quarters for another hour, listening for any sign of survival, wreckage floating to the surface, life rafts, anything. There was nothing. I-174 had gone down in 200 feet of water, too deep for survivors, even if anyone had escaped the flooded compartments. After dawn, they spotted an oil slick and some debris, bits of wood, fabric, a single life preserver with Japanese characters stenciled on it. Evans ordered the debris photographed and logged. Then he went to his quarters, closed the door, and allowed himself 5 minutes to shake. Word of Johnston's kill spread through the destroyer squadron within hours. Radio protocols prevented detailed discussion of the attack, but every captain in Task Force 38 knew. Evans had engaged a submarine contact and sunk it with a single attack run. No extended hunt, no pattern of depth charges, no guesswork. One attack. One kill. That didn't happen with depth charges, ever. By the time Johnston returned to Pearl Harbor 10 days later, 6 other destroyer captains were waiting at the dock to talk to Evans. They didn't ask how he'd done it. They asked 2 questions. "What do we need?" and "How long will installation take?" Evans told them. 2 of the captains walked away. They weren't willing to risk their careers on an unauthorized weapon system, even one that worked. 4 stayed. Within 3 weeks, 4 more Fletcher-class destroyers had been secretly equipped with bootleg Hedgehog systems scavenged from British ships, fabricated from scratch, or, in one creative case, stolen outright from a warehouse in Auckland, where the US Navy was stockpiling equipment designated for transfer to New Zealand corvettes. The Bureau of Ordnance remained officially unaware, or perhaps more accurately, they were aware but unable to definitively prove anything, without launching an investigation that would expose how badly their own depth charge doctrine had failed. In the chaos of late 1943, with the Pacific War escalating and submarines sinking American ships every week, nobody in Washington wanted to court-martial destroyer captains for winning. Between November 1943 and March 1944, the 5 destroyers equipped with Hedgehog systems sank 11 Japanese submarines. 11. The rest of the Pacific destroyer force, 170 ships still using depth charges, sank 14 in the same period. The statistics were impossible to ignore. In January 1944, Commander Raymond Spruance, commanding the 5th Fleet, personally requested that the Bureau of Ordnance explain why a handful of destroyers were achieving 5 times the kill rate of the rest of the fleet. The Bureau sent an inspection team to Pearl Harbor. They interviewed Evans. They examined Johnston. They saw the Hedgehog system and the fabricated mounting and the wiring Sullivan had installed. The lead inspector, a captain who'd spent the last 3 years behind a desk in Washington, asked Evans directly, "Commander, where did you obtain this weapon system?" Evans looked him in the eye and said, "From HMS Brighton, sir. They were replacing it. I thought we could use it. Was I wrong?" The inspector spent a long moment staring at the Hedgehog's mounting bracket, clearly calculating whether pursuing this would result in commendations or court-martial proceedings. Finally, he said, "Bureau of Ordnance is initiating formal evaluation of the Hedgehog system for fleet-wide implementation. Until that evaluation is complete, your current installation will be classified as a experimental field testing. Carry on, Commander." Evans saluted. The inspector left. Nothing else was said. 3 months later, the Bureau of Ordnance officially approved the Mark 10 and Mark 11 Hedgehog systems for installation on all U.S. destroyers, destroyer escorts, and anti-submarine frigates. Production contracts were issued. Installation schedules were drawn up. By mid-1944, Hedgehog systems were being installed at the rate of 30 per month. By the end of World War II, 175 Fletcher-class destroyers carried Hedgehog systems. So did hundreds of destroyer escorts and patrol frigates. In the final 18 months of the Pacific War, those ships sank 127 Japanese submarines using Hedgehog attacks, more than 4 times the number sunk by depth charges in the previous 18 months. The effectiveness was staggering. Depth charge attacks had a 3% kill rate. Hedgehog attacks had a 28% kill rate, more than 6 times higher. The reason was simple. Contact was never lost, the submarine had no warning, and hitting the target meant certain death. Japanese submarine doctrine, which had remained largely unchanged since 1942, collapsed. Submarine captains who'd learned to evade depth charge attacks discovered, too late, that their tactics didn't work against Hedgehog. There was no moment when the American destroyer went blind. No gap when you could dive or turn and escape. The mortars just appeared out of nowhere and killed you. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, commander of the Japanese Navy's submarine force, wrote in a classified memo dated July 1944, "American anti-submarine capabilities have increased dramatically. Previous evasion tactics are no longer effective. Submarine losses have tripled. Cause unknown. Recommend immediate investigation." The investigation concluded, correctly, that American destroyers had deployed a new forward-throwing weapon system, but Japanese intelligence never obtained detailed specifications. They knew it existed. They knew it was deadly. They couldn't figure out how to counter it. By September 1944, Japanese submarine operations in the Central Pacific had been effectively shut down. The boats that remained operational stayed in port, or operated in shallow coastal waters, where Hedgehog-equipped destroyers couldn't easily hunt them. The Japanese submarine service, which had begun the war with high hopes of strangling American supply lines, ended it as an afterthought. Undersupplied, undertrained, and terrified of American destroyers. None of this was officially credited to Evans. His name appears nowhere in the Bureau of Ordnance reports on Hedgehog implementation. The official history credits British innovation, American manufacturing, and field testing by Pacific Fleet assets. No individuals are mentioned. No specific ships are named. Evans received a Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in action against enemy submarines in March 1944. The citation doesn't mention Hedgehog. It doesn't mention unauthorized installation of experimental weapons. It credits him with aggressive and innovative anti-submarine tactics, resulting in the confirmed destruction of multiple enemy vessels. He never told the press. He never wrote a memoir. When reporters asked him about his submarine kills after the war, he said, "We had good sonar operators, and we got lucky." Johnston herself never returned from the war. On October 25, 1944, during the Battle off Samar in the Philippines, she engaged a Japanese surface force that included the battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. Evans charged Yamato with 5 destroyers and torpedo boats, knowing they couldn't win, but needing to buy time for American escort carriers to escape. Johnston scored at least 1 torpedo hit on Yamato before Japanese cruisers and destroyers surrounded her and pounded her to scrap. She sank at 0950 hours. Evans went down with his ship. He was 37 years old. Of Johnston's crew of 327, only 141 survived. Evans received the Medal of Honor posthumously, the first Native American naval officer to receive the award. The citation mentions his actions at Samar. It doesn't mention submarines. It doesn't mention Hedgehog. The other 4 captains who'd installed bootleg Hedgehog systems survived the war. Lieutenant Commander Ashford, the British captain who'd accidentally let Evans take HMS Brighton's Hedgehog hardware, was promoted to captain and commanded a cruiser in the invasion of Okinawa. Chief Machinist's mate Larson, who'd fabricated the mounting bracket, received a Bronze Star and retired to Wisconsin, where he opened a machine shop. Lieutenant Hagen became a commander and taught gunnery tactics at the Naval Academy until 1962. Chief Torpedoman Sullivan stayed in the Navy until 1955, training new generations of sailors on contact-fused weapons. None of them ever spoke publicly about what they'd done. In 1967, A naval historian researching anti-submarine warfare tactics during WPO interviewed Sullivan about Hedgehog deployment. Sullivan was 68, living in San Diego, working part-time at a maritime museum. The historian asked how long it had taken for the Navy to officially approve Hedgehog installation on U.S. destroyers. Sullivan smiled and said, "Longer than it should have." "Why was that?" "Bureaucracy," Sullivan said. "The usual reasons. Some folks needed convincing." "How were they convinced?" Sullivan looked at the historian for a long moment. "Field results. When something works, it's hard to argue." The historian pressed for details. Sullivan politely declined to provide them. The interview ended. Commander Ernest Evans was buried at sea off the Philippines. There's a destroyer named after him now. USS Evans DDG-35, commissioned in 1963. His Medal of Honor citation hangs in the Pentagon, and there's a small memorial in Pawnee, Oklahoma, a bronze plaque noting that he was the first Native American in the Navy to reach command rank. The plaque doesn't mention submarines. It doesn't mention that his unauthorized installation of a British weapons system changed the submarine war in the Pacific and saved an estimated 3,000 American lives by ending Japanese submarine operations 18 months earlier than they would have otherwise. Robert Chen, Morrison's friend who survived Johnston's torpedo hit, never opened the auto repair shop. He worked at the Bremerton Naval Shipyard until 1978, maintaining destroyer engines. He died in 1983 at age 61. His obituary in the Seattle Times mentioned he was a Navy veteran. It didn't mention Morrison. It didn't mention that he'd watched his best friend die because American anti-submarine tactics were built on institutional pride rather than results. In 1998, a deep-sea exploration team located I-174's wreck site 180 miles northeast of Truk Lagoon, resting in 200 feet of water. The submarine's hull shows 4 distinct impact craters, each approximately 18 inches in diameter, consistent with Hedgehog projectile strikes. The bow and stern sections have separated and the midship area is completely collapsed. Marine archaeologists studying the wreck noted that flooding would have been instantaneous. The crew would have had no time to escape. Japanese records recovered after the war identified 68 men aboard I-174 when she sailed on her final patrol. Their families were told the submarine was lost in action, with no further details. Commander Shinji Nakamura was posthumously promoted to captain. His widow received his ashes in a ceremonial box, empty because no bodies were ever recovered. There's no memorial for I-174's crew. There's no plaque in Japan commemorating their service. Their footnotes in naval archives, names in personnel logs, ghosts in the Pacific Deep. War doesn't care about fairness. It cares about results. The Hedgehog worked. Depth charges mostly didn't. 175 Fletcher-class destroyers carried Hedgehog systems by the end of the war, and those systems killed more than 120 Japanese submarines in 18 months. That's 120 submarines that didn't sink American troop transports, didn't torpedo American cruisers, didn't put American sailors in the water screaming for help while sharks circled. 3,000 American lives saved, conservatively, because one destroyer captain in Pearl Harbor decided regulations mattered less than results, and because a handful of enlisted men were willing to spend 11 nights installing an unauthorized weapon system that their own Navy had rejected. The official histories credit British innovation and American manufacturing. They're not wrong, but innovations don't win wars. People do. People who look at a broken system, understand why it's broken, and fix it, whether they have permission or not. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now. Stories like Commander Evans's are vanishing from history because nobody's talking about them. Your engagement tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history, not just the sanitized version in textbooks. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of forgotten heroes who changed history without recognition. These men didn't do it for medals, most of them never got any, but we owe them the courtesy of remembering. And drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, your country, your city. Did you serve? Did someone in your family serve? Do you know a veteran who never talked about what they did? We want to hear from you. We have viewers from Jakarta to Brooklyn, from Aberdeen to Adelaide. You're part of this community. Thank you for keeping these men's memories alive. Because of people like you, Ernest Evans and William Morrison, and the 68 men aboard I-174 aren't forgotten. They're remembered. They mattered. And their story, this story, still has something to teach us about courage, innovation, and the cost of bureaucratic pride. Until next time, remember the past. Honor the sacrifice and never stop questioning whether the official version is the whole truth, because sometimes it's not.